Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Melbourne Press Club's third and final webinar in our series on misinformation and disinformation. Apologies, we're a bit late getting underway. We had a few technical issues, which I'm sure some of you are well familiar with in the webinar land. I'm Nick Richardson. I'm CEO of the Melbourne Press Club. I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people who are the traditional custodians of the land. I'd also like to pay respects to the elders, both past, present, of the Kulin Nation and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians present. Some housekeeping first. We'll be having a discussion with our moderator and panellists for about 35 minutes. Please put your questions in the Q&A section of the webinar and we'll respond to those after that initial discussion. So in this three-part webinar series, we've looked at the challenges of misinformation and disinformation for journalists and the broader media sector. We've looked at some of the strategies that can help and some of the perils involved in reporting on elections when information is so contested. Today, we're going to take a deeper look at the operating environment for our digital platforms and discuss what kind of regulatory approaches could help us navigate this complicated landscape. So here to moderate our chat today is the ABC's national technology reporter, Ange Lavoipierre. Ange is also an award-winning comedian and writer whose AI reporting for Background Briefing won an Australian Podcast Award last year. Ange is also the creator and host of the ABC's Schmeitgeist podcast about trends and phenomena in tech and internet culture. Previously, Ange was the host of the ABC's daily news podcast, The Signal. Ange, over to you.
Thanks so much, Nick. G'day, everyone. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land. I'm in Eora. And I'm really pleased to be here hosting this session just because this is the stuff that I am thinking about every other day of the week. So really pleased to be here. I am going to introduce our two guests, and I apologise, I'm going to be very obviously reading because they do have very long and impressive resumes and I don't want to get them wrong. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Reese Farthing. So Reese is the Policy Director at Reset Tech Australia. She's worked as an academic and policy analyst at not-for-profits at universities and think tanks in Australia, the UK and the US. There's a list of organisations here: Reset Tech, Five Rights Foundation, Fair Play, University of Oxford, if you've heard of it, and RMIT. Reese is also an associate investigator at the Centre for the Digital Child. And Reese, where are you coming to us from today?
I'm actually in London at the moment doing some work around the UK election preparations.
Very glamorous, although maybe sounds more glamorous than it is. I'm sure you're working really hard. The other guest today, also from Reset Tech, is Alice Dawkins. Alice Dawkins is the Executive Director of Reset Tech Australia. Before Reset, Alice worked to establish the Frontier Technology Initiative at the Minderoo Foundation. She was a Schwartzman Scholar at Tsinghua University, where she studied Chinese entrepreneurship and AI governance. Prior to that, she worked on democracy and justice issues in Myanmar. So a wonderful, varied curriculum vitae there for both of you. And welcome. Thanks for being here. As for where to start, so this conversation is intended to focus on what the government can be doing to address misinformation and disinformation. But as anyone here who's ever tried to cover the topic or really engage with the policy space will know, it is an incredibly vexed category. And that's part of the problem that we encounter here. So, it's almost fitting really, isn't it? So you've got the government means one thing when they talk about mis and disinformation, the opposition means another. And of course, platforms have their own ideas too. So in reality, we know mis and disinformation intersects with a whole range of online harms, and the Australian government can be doing more much more on all of them to intervene. I think they'd probably be the first to say so at the moment. So maybe a good place to start is by getting you guys to furnish us with a definition for mis and disinformation, as well as some of the, I guess, adjacent risks, which do need the government's urgent attention at the moment.
Sure. Thanks, Ange. I'll take that one if I can. Never keen to miss an opportunity to talk about definitions. But I think you're absolutely right here. Like, what we've got to remember that what we're talking about is this really broad landscape of digital risks that platforms create, and locating mis and disinformation on that spectrum. It's just one part of a much broader problem. And I think what we see in Australia is that mis and disinformation as a phrase has become this catch-all phrase to try and capture everything that we sort of mean that's risky, when actually what we're talking about is this broad set of issues around online information and how it's shared and distorted. And in a regulatory approach, I think it's really important to keep that sort of the breadth and the spectrum of those risks on the table, because actually we want to cover everything beyond mis and disinformation as well. Just focusing on mis and disinformation isn't going to get you very far. And so, just as a sort of example, in the broad world of digital risks of note, particularly in the context of democracy and elections, there's, off the top of my head, I can think of just five types of different risk we'd want to talk about. So firstly, yes, mis and disinformation is really important. And these are the things that are factually and provably wrong, like, the obvious one, vaccines cause autism. And again, this is a really obvious starting place for thinking about what some of the risks are. But it is just that, right? Misinformation is largely where we say these sort of factually and provably wrong things are shared organically or accidentally by people. Disinformation is where we say it's sort of spread with the intent to sort of misinform. But it's this sort of stuff about things that are wrong, basically. But that's not everything. That's not the whole set of risks. If you move beyond that, you start to realise that there's also content and risks that are threats to electoral integrity. And so these would be things like content that talks about, the election would be rigged, therefore don't go and vote, or other content that sort of tries to suppress voting or interfere with electoral outcomes. And in Australia, this is quite often called mis and disinformation, and it can be, but quite often it's a separate thing. Like sometimes, content that is a real threat to electoral integrity is not provably false because it's talking about what will happen in the future. These elections will be rigged. There will be this sort of thing happen, and that's not provably wrong because you can't disprove the future. But it's content that I think we, absolutely need to look at as well. There's also content that's foreign interference. That's another type of risk. So, content that the election will be rigged, but, this time it's China or Russia or whoever's saying it, and that can be, like I said, mis and disinformation, but it also sometimes isn't. So, it can be a huge over amplification of the truth. So in Europe, where I sort of am at the moment, I've been in Berlin for the last month doing some election monitoring work over there. And we've seen huge over amplifications of particular things like, the Polish farmers' protests about Ukrainian grain. It's true, there were protests, but the way that was distorted in the social media ecosystem was for a particular reason, and it came from a sort of act of foreign interference. Again, serious digital risk, not always mis and disinformation. There's also coordinated inauthentic behaviour, which is like foreign interference, but where it's not a state-based actor doing it. So, again, it's the over-amplification of things that could be true, or it might be mis and disinformation for a particular reason. And then lastly, I think, one of the pieces of content that we've got to be really mindful of that isn't mis and disinformation is incitement to violence or sedition. So if we start seeing posts like, I don't know, Western Sydney should take down Eastern Sydney or something, and that sounds ridiculous, but we saw that in January 6th. That doesn't fall into the bracket of mis and disinformation, but it's a particular real risk that we've got to look at as well. So there's this like whole world of digital risks that are important, and they're not covered by the Online Safety Act, or as we can see, they don't envisage to be covered by the Online Safety Act, that we need regulatory action on if we want to see Australian democracy safeguarded through the actions of the sort of online digital world.
Alice.
Yeah, I was just going to jump into Reese's excellent list because it might help the audience if we just think how, if we work with that list of 5 risks, how they do or do not carry over into different policy areas. I'm noting that the framework is indicative, not exhaustive. So the first one, this mis and disinformation category, it is managed by the Digi Voluntary Industry Code, which Andrew's done some great reporting on, and that is this downstream of fact-checking issue. The second, I would argue it's partially captured by the Voluntary Industry Code and bits of the Electoral Act. The third, and sorry, I'll reiterate what I'm talking about. The third, foreign interference, I would argue doesn't have a natural place. The fourth, CIB, similarly, they're partially captured by the Voluntary Industry Code, but also not completely. And then there's also this scheme of digital risks that are handled elsewhere by online safety laws and online safety frameworks. So I suppose if we think through how these risks sit in our current framework, there's a lot of gaps. And as Reese's opening provocation takes us, mis and disinformation is a helpful keyword and frame of reference to start with, but without getting into the weeds, it's probably not where we want to end.
Oh, I think we're in the weeds. Don't worry about that. You've kind of touched on it already, but just to kind of really make it clear, for those thinking about reporting on the political landscape here, the risk of an overly narrow definition of mis and disinformation is that, Australia is then locked into another, however many years, whether that's maybe like potentially decades until reform is achieved, where the risks that you've outlined, which are they intersect with that's very strict definition, where those are then excluded from regulatory frameworks. Is that kind of like what's at stake here?
Yeah. Or you end up sort of trying to push the definition of mis and disinformation into a world where you get problems. You're like, oh, this is mis and disinformation, and people are like, it's not provably false, and you're like, yes, but it's a risk. And that's when I think you start to get into issues where people are like, who's in charge of determining what's the truth if things aren't provably false?
Right, and this is the territory that we've found ourselves in already this year when it comes to the mis and disinformation. Well, it was maybe even last year, the time's blurring, but anyway, there was an exposure draft of the bill. It's since been set on a shelf, being reviewed, and we're expecting to see more of that later. I want to come back to what the opportunity for Australia is there and what you would like to see, in that area, but also, the government is reviewing the Online Safety Act at the moment. There's a lot of moving parts, for Australia at the moment. But Reese, I wanted to maybe call on you to, just because you are so EU based at the moment and in general, and you have such a good sense of that regulatory environment as well. And they do things very differently to how we do them here. Tell us what the difference is, and I guess how the EU is dealing with mis and disinfo.
Yeah, sure. I'm delighted to. So I think in Europe, we're seeing in real time how the Digital Services Act, which is a sort of large regulatory piece that they put in place to manage this, it really compels platforms to be pretty attentive to how they handle the broad range of risks online, including those that I sort of articulated earlier. And platforms need to meet really stringent compliance requirements, which requires investing, not insignificant amounts of personnel and tech development into trust and safety, right? Into how they actually proactively attempt to mitigate these risks. So, there's accountability measures on platforms. Platforms actually have to take responsibility for the risks that their platforms create. They have to proactively identify and mitigate these risks, in conjunction with regulators. And they have to be transparent and open about what's going on their platforms, and where there's failures, regulators are enabled to take action and enforce changes. So not just sort of enforce transparency or these sorts of things, they can actually compel redress. And we know about all of these and what they're doing because there are mandatory reporting or public transparency requirements that compel platforms to report, both annually and in real-time cadence about what's going on in their platforms. And we see that, it's this sort of overarching legislation that the Digital Service Act has introduced, these overarching obligations. And we are actually seeing in Europe platforms take note. So, for example, at the moment, the European Commission are taking an enforcement action against Meta specifically around targeted disinformation and foreign interference in the context of the European elections. So specifically, they're looking at how Meta allows misinformation in paid advertising and coordinated inauthentic activity through ads, and also how those ads are not often accurately labelled as political. And, we see in Europe, the European Commission is taking action on these. These are also problems for Australia. Like we see these in Australia at reset.tech. We did some experiments around this in the sort of voice referendum. These are problems that exist in Australia, but there's nowhere for those problems to go. It's just like, oh, look, there's a problem. What can you do? Whereas in Europe, actually, you've got a regulator who's like, okay, your platform isn't up to scratch on this. We're going to take action and you're going to have to address this. And we can see how these actions start to drive change. So as part of the enforcement action around the fact that Meta wasn't doing enough to safeguard the European election, we've seen how Meta has, I think it was just 3 days ago, turned CrowdTangle or turned a version of CrowdTangle back on for EU researchers and EU states to enable transparency around election posts. Like there was some real-time action that was like, Meta, you need to do better. Meta, like, okay, fine, we'll revive CrowdTangle for this little bit just so that there's something covering this elections, right? Like you can see this response happening from platforms where regulators are like, you've got to tackle these risks properly. And then when you turn to Australia, we just don't get that. We just don't have that same sort of reactive ability.
I've just seen the first of what I hope will be many questions come up in the Q&A. This is a timely moment to perhaps remind people that there will be questions. Of course, there will be. It's Press Club in a little while, so please do pop your questions there and we'll get to them. We'll have a think about them. I just wanted to, I guess maybe take the moment to draw a contrast to Australia, because you've just sort of painted this picture of, this environment where things are changing and the laws have had a notable impact on platform practice and behaviour. Alice, from where you sit here in Australia, and I guess, the conversations that you have around policy and with policymakers, where is Australia in contrast to that? Obviously, we're facing an identical set of harms. What powers are there in Australia at the moment to regulate that?
Yeah, so my answer is going to be a little shorter than Reese's. So I suppose it's obviously less extensive for all the reasons that have been laid out, which is that we don't have that kind of comprehensive framework yet. We may have by the end of the year, which would be quite exciting. So taking out the seriously harmful online content that, as we said, is captured elsewhere by the Online Safety Act. When it comes to mis and disinformation, with all the caveats we've laid out at the start, all platforms are doing at the moment is they're submitting a report to the Industry Association. That report for the last calendar year went live on Friday. So I would certainly invite members to go and have a look for themselves at what platforms are reporting on, what they're reporting against. Our perspective, as particularly when you read them against what they report on in the European Union, they are narrative-based reports. They're quite general in nature. And there's a single independent assessor who honestly can't screen for too much other than syntax, because no one's got good baseline data in Australia. I'll note, in fairness to the platforms, there's been a shift from providing only global numbers to, I think, Australian numbers have been slowly provided in the last few years. But this is a pretty slow pace of change compared to the frameworks we're seeing light up elsewhere. The implication of this, I guess, as in a very starved data environment and also a very light touch regulatory environment, is we lack an ecosystem that's asking the right kind of questions to get the right kind of mitigation measures out of platforms. We know that platforms, their response is commensurate to the pressure applied. And an example of, I suppose, the questions that we should begin to ask is to shift from what we see a lot in Australia, which is questions of what misinformation is circulating and how much is there. So questions of quantum, questions of categories. And so platforms will answer in their Digi reports, oh, we've removed 9.2 million XYZ. We've removed, over 800,000 of this. And if we're not improving the questions we're asking, that's the only answer we're going to get. So I suppose what we need to shift our questions into being of platforms is, what are your attempts to mitigate misinformation, disinformation, and other types of threats? What are you doing and how well are you doing it? And let's have the opportunity to assess and scrutinize those measures. So it's a massive shift in how we think about the issue.
It seems like Australia is, I don't want to make too many assumptions here, but maybe you could situate us, compared to, I guess, our peers in Western democracies and sort of Anglosphere, like for like environments in other senses. Where is Australia in the pack? How soft a touch are we for the platforms?
Alice will take. My answer is pretty simple. We're pretty proud. We don't have anything. When it comes to the types of risks that we're talking about here, it's all done by voluntary industry written codes. That doesn't get you very far, and that's, to me, as someone who's sort of been following this debate, it looks like we are where Europe was in 2018, 2019, before they realised it didn't work and then took serious action. We're still stuck here.
I think the other thing that I'd note on top of that is that, and this is, it's no failure, it's just an observation of the ecosystem. Our civil society and research ecosystem sort of lacks the data to ask the right questions of platforms, and that's no one's fault. That's just because we're dealing with tiny little shreds of intel that we're getting out of platforms, and you've got to take quite, I'd say, deliberate and careful measures to replicate what other markets can do very, very easily with the platform data they're provided. So we're in a data-starved environment, and as a result, the types of research questions and evidence that we're putting out into the public domain are limited. And it takes us back to that problem of counting misinformation without a denominator, creating categories of misinformation that sort of get us nowhere, because there's this so what element of, okay, but how does this map against what platforms say they do, what their policies are, how are we really testing how they're mitigating this problem against what they've themselves signed up to? I think that's what we're kind of obsessed about, returning to that question.
Yeah, to use a metaphor that journalists will appreciate, I suppose, it reminds me of, in order to submit a good FOI request, you sort of need someone to tell you where the treasure or the bodies are buried in the first place. Like, you sort of have to know a little bit in order to know more. And it seems like Australia's still off the map in that respect. I do want to go to questions soon, but before we get there, and there's some great ones coming in, thank you for those. Before we get there, I guess, what are the opportunities for Australia? If this is an illness, what is the medicine? What do you guys think?
Can I take this one, Alice? Because this is so rare for me. I get to say I'm really optimistic about what's going on in Australia. We seem to be at this moment in time where we are reviewing our Online Safety Act, we're reviewing our privacy reforms, we've got the ACCC sort of starting to well, I mean, they have been for a long time, but they are returning to look at digital platforms. And we also have the potential of this sort of mis and disinformation bill in whatever form sort of coming back. So in effect, we've got the eye of government saying, hey, there's something going on digital platforms with regard to digital risks. What do we do? And I think just that policy moment is incredibly exciting that, there does seem to be a will to do something. From sort of our perspective at Reset Tech, it turns out that today I like to group everything into fives, but we do have a kind of idea, drawing on international examples of where regulation has been implemented in, the EU and the UK, looking at what Canada's doing, those sorts of things. There seems to be sort of 5 core ingredients to regulation that's needed that I think we're in a moment in Australia where we could get these in, which is hence the optimism. But the 5 ingredients are, look, firstly, you need some sort of accountability measure or an enforceable duty. You need something to flip the table a little bit and place the responsibility onto the platforms themselves for the risks that they create, not the end users and what they're posting or who's seeing it. It's like platforms have to take a bulk of accountability. The second thing you need after that is risk assessments. So platforms actually have to do these proactive risk assessments to identify the risks. Then they have to make sure that there's adequate mitigations that match the scale and scope of the risks that they've identified. You need transparency measures. So you need to be able to see what's going on, both for the public and regulators. As you talked about, it's about creating that environment where we know what questions to ask. And then lastly, there's got to be enforceability, right? Like, this all falls down if there isn't any way to enforce rules and requirements, and if there's no way to compel platforms to actually change practices or processes, then we're a bit stuck. And if you blend these together as elements, you get a model where a broad range of digital risks can be proactively and preventatively sort of managed right across digital platforms of all varieties, but also across all sorts of digital platforms and services, and where there's the incentivation to do so.
I have seen your hand, Alice. I'll come to you, but I just wanted to sort of acknowledge something here, which is that I think there is a very collapsed conversation here in Australia, which is that at the moment there's a lot of rhetoric coming out of Canberra about, like, a lot of tough talk basically, and we're giving the Safety Commissioner extra powers, we're reviewing the OSA, the Online Safety Act, deep fakes, age verification tech, and people, there's just a lot of announceables, and I think it's really contrary to everything that we're hearing from you today about the holes in that net, which, probably bring it to a point of defying the definition of a net. And I guess, I just wanted to address that, because it's like a really it won't make sense to people who aren't hearing this, who aren't familiar with this policy space. And how do you account for that gulf?
I suppose, Reece, I can take this if you like. I have a lot of sympathy for policy decision makers at this time, because the themes that what Reece has just laid out in other markets took years. It took hundreds of people and thousands of hours of drafting. So I don't expect Australia to be able to achieve this overnight, because what we're trying to recommend here is a shift from a content focus to social media digital platform regulation to systemic regulation. That is a giant shift to achieve. It's as we lay out, it's possible, there's a framework for it. But we make it sound so easy, like, oh, you've just got to flip the switch so that you incentivize digital platforms to do a whole bunch of stuff that they don't want to do. It's structurally, intellectually difficult. We're also in a very small market compared to these other democracies that have just been listed. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I guess I'm indicating to policymakers that I appreciate what they've got to do. One thing I just wanted to note, as I put my hand up, was to note on Reece's very elegant 5 pillars framework that the message to reinforce is you can't just peel off one or two pillars and go, oh, this is great. We like this one. We like transparency. Sounds really good. You can have the world's best mechanism for public transparency into digital platforms. And as a spoiler alert, we'll be saying more on this soon. But if that's not matched with legislated obligations, muscular escalation channels for regulators, all these other ingredients, metrics for assessing whether platforms are passing or failing on their reported duties, all you get is an avalanche of data with nowhere to go. So to give a precise example, just say we improve the rigor and the specificity of those transparency reports released by Digi. That would be great, but they need to have somewhere to sit so that there's independent scrutiny, external scrutiny, testing, all of these things that, again, are getting built up in other countries. And I take the point that we've got a bit of work to do in Australia to get to where other democracies are. And I think hopefully this year's the year for it.
I love that optimism, but the goalposts that you're sort of describing are incredibly, I find it daunting listening to it, and I'm just an observer, so I can't imagine how it must be for you too. I do want to, we've got 3 questions so far. I'm just going to start with the first one. Is the rise of generative AI one of the biggest dangers in the mis and disinformation threat environment? I mean, yeah, there's been a big conversation about this. And are there any current initiatives in Australia or Europe or elsewhere to counter the misuse of this technology? So I guess, who is doing it well? How can we do it better?
Yeah, such a good question. And look, from my perspective, generative AI really amplifies the scale of the risks. So we're seeing right now in the EU election context how generative AI is being used to generate fresh and new content that contains mis and disinformation. And each time it's put up, it takes fact checkers hours to debunk, right? Like every time you create new content, you create a new piece of work for the downstream machinery. It's the same sort of risks, though. So the same sort of regulatory risk framework can handle this, both in terms of the risk obligations and the mitigation obligations placed on content sharing platforms like your social media platforms, your search engines, those sort of things, but also generative AI platforms themselves. But the scale of what's going on is truly wild. And I think this is, if anything, it sort of talks about the need for us to do this fast. Because if we've already been struggling without generative AI, the rate at which generative AI can speed up all of those threats that we talked about earlier is real.
Alice, you'd be familiar with because there's a whole separate machine that's running, and of course some of the risks and harms from Gen AI will be captured in there's an ambition to capture them in the review of the Online Safety Act, perhaps other places. You would know better than me, but yeah, and then there's been a separate negotiation going on with the industry. There's been a lot of consultation, countless Senate committees, and there's a lot of talk going on. Where is it all going in Canberra at the moment? What are we moving towards in terms of regulating AI, and on what kind of time frame? Do you know?
The short answer, Andy, is I'm not sure, but I might indicate where we might end up is, look, Reese and I popped out a little draft green paper, I think it was earlier on in April or May. And we talked about the opportunity that's here for government to do something that we very cryptically call comprehensive digital regulation. And if you read our small paper on it, it'll make sense what that actually looks like. But the point is, there's all these active policy processes that involve digital platforms and involve a recalibration of power towards the public interest in some sort. We're seeing it with the News Media Bargaining Code. We're seeing it with this emerging chatter around AI that's super important. We're seeing it with online safety. We're seeing it with misinformation. So I guess the point that we make in that short paper is, how can we see these as indicators of digital risks that need a coordinated approach? That's a really tricky word to use in policymaking because they're falling across so many portfolio areas. But I think one of the opportunities we might see to link up some of these issues and show a bit of coherence is in the joint committee process that's opening up, that's going to run for the next 2.5 months, right? Where Parliament is going to be asking a whole bunch of connected issues at the same time. So the terms of reference of that inquiry is quite interesting because there's bits on the News Media Bargaining Code, there's bits on online safety, there's bits on information and information integrity. So that could be quite a sort of an elegant domain to try and show to policymakers all these issues come from the same source and they can be fixed at the source with a risk-based systemic approach. Sorry to use jargon.
You can't help it, I know. That's the social media joint committee for anyone who playing along at home, because there are a few, maybe not so many joint. Anyway, we'll move on. You did just mention the News Media Bargaining Code, and we have a question here about that. So it's sort of predicated on a speculative future where Meta and or Alphabet, let's be honest, it's more likely to be Meta based on based on the current landscape. They're pulled out of the code. What impact does that have on the government's attempts to regulate misinformation on this platform? And I suppose this is something that I've thought about a bit, but I've never had a satisfactory answer, is that we have this I guess you could say relatively hostile footing at the moment between the platforms, certainly Meta anyway, and the government, and all this community concern about online harms of all kinds. And I wondered if, these are the conditions, if that kind of intersects, if Meta pulling out of the code and or not participating in pulling out has kind of created that crucible for a lot of the change that seems to be now on foot.
Reese, I can start this, and Reese might want to fact check me, which would be welcome. Look, I find this framing so interesting because it's like we're making the News Media Bargaining Code out to be something that's got to fix all of the problems of digital platform accountability. It was never meant to be that. It's quite a modest instrument that does a very specific thing. And anyone who was around at the time who was involved in it would tell you that, I think they'd agree with me. So I think I don't want to stretch the News Media Bargaining Code to do things it was never meant to do. I also want to mention it is a gentle instrument that relies on the goodwill of co-regulation. So I think the lesson we have from this experience is that let's stop relying on the goodwill of co-regulation. And we're seeing how digital platforms' power is being tried and tested in courts now. And I know, Ange, you've been deep in court documents just as I have in the last few weeks. And so from that, there's one point I want to make here, which is on kind of jurisdiction and enforceability. That is a topic no one wants to talk about because it's alarming and it's hard. But let's just return to this Meta issue. They make, ACCC estimates $5 billion annually out of our market. That's not nothing. I don't know too many companies that are going to walk away from 5 billion Australian dollars in revenue annually over something like that. However, despite that size of annual revenue, there's this partially untested legal argument that they don't do business in Australia. And that to me feels quite critical. And I think it's an issue that has to be handled sooner rather than later, because this is probably a little bit too candid, but we're currently in a little bit of a pantomime about this company. Is Meta Australia doing business here? Are they not? Who are we talking to when we talk to Meta Australia? I think these issues have to be sort of fleshed out in the open of what kind of corporate structure we're dealing with and what they think their responsibilities to Australia really are, because we're in this very kind of murky grey area right now, and that's probably all I should say.
Oh, well, and you can nix this in just like take it as a comment or whatever if you think that this is something that we shouldn't be talking about because of it's before courts. But it strikes me that we have seen this fight in a few places. We've seen it between the Privacy Commissioner and Meta over Cambridge Analytica. That is still being negotiated. We see it obviously in eSafety versus X in federal court. And we've also seen X lose a fight around jurisdiction in Queensland recently. And I guess one of the challenges here is that it's dependent on the piece of law. Like, there can be maybe the Anti-Discrimination Act in Queensland, it considers Meta to have been to be doing business in Australia, or any other platform to be doing business in Australia, but it doesn't carry over. I don't know if that's if that's something you want to. We've probably got time for it. Yeah.
I think just 10 seconds of comment would just be that these are the questions we have to deal with when we move from light touch industry-led regulation into real regulation. They're issues that don't really come up when we're doing this dance of self or co-regulation. And Reese is nodding, which cheers me. So I would say that these are one of the many issues we've got to crunch through that are not simple issues at all, but they have to get dealt with as we move towards, I think, this inevitable domain of proper regulation, as we would put any other company under in this market.
There's a question from Sue Elson online, and obviously online, Ange, but they've asked, have the policy changes in Europe made a significant change to how platforms or enterprises behave online? And I love this question because, you go, well, like you were saying, Reese, at the start, like, they set up the in-house practices to accommodate the demands of regulators in one jurisdiction, and you would think that it would then be just that much easier for other jurisdictions to get the same kind of information out of them. But correct me, but I don't know that that's always been the case. What have we seen?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and you're right. What we see is that platforms turn on and off safety features in different countries, like even child safety features that you'd imagine that once they decided that this is what kids need to be safe, they'd roll them out internationally. It's like, no, they turn them on where regulation demands. And in Europe, we are starting to see them. They're small, they're getting bigger, but they're very, very real. So I'll give you an example that we might be familiar with in Australia on X, or what was Twitter, to report electoral information. Australians used to have this ability that you could report misinformation about political topics. If there was a post, you could label it specifically as political misinformation. That label would then be fed into a specialised pipeline of content moderators who were meant to look at this, and in principle, Twitter, as it was then, would action this. They turned this feature off in Australia about 2 weeks before the Voice referendum. They just decided they didn't want to offer this to Australians anymore. It was the basis of a complaint that Reset.tech made to Digi that meant that X were removed from the mis and disinformation code. The ultimate act of powerlessness of a code is that when you violate it, you just get removed from it, But on that very same day that they turned it off in Australia, what we saw in Europe is it was a massive change of the pipeline, right? They just shifted all those trust and safety experts. They played it as a zero-sum game to Europe. And when I sit in Europe with my laptop on X, I can report a piece of post as electoral misinformation that goes into an amped up content moderation pipeline and process where they've got more trust and safety staff looking at this because it's a legal requirement and they have to action it within this many hours, So on X, they played it as a zero-sum game. They took it away from some countries to sort of pump it into Europe rather than just expanding it everywhere. But you can see that, this is exactly how platforms play, where changes happen, where regulations compel them.
That just sounds like topsy-turvy land, making a complaint about X and something, a report about X and something happening. That's really wild to hear that described. We've got a couple more minutes before we have to wrap up, but I just wanted to ask you both for your advice to journalists. It's going to be a big year on reporting on this stuff. We've got a pretty acute duty, I think, to do a good job of reporting this space. It's going to be incredibly active. So what are you kind of looking for from the media this year as these debates, particularly around mis and disinfo and other online harms, play out?
Reese is looking at me, so I think I'm on the hook for this one. I would say one hopefully coherent and simple thing, which would be resist the urge to go where platforms want to take you, which is in the weeds of what kind of content is this. Platforms love to talk about these sort of use case examples of this post or this post. Platforms love it when we end up in these sort of free speech debates. It's a tactic that takes us away from the root cause, which is how well do their systems work? How well are they following their own policies? So I think as attractive as it is to get drawn into these questions of size of perceived misinformation, types of perceived misinformation, examples of disinformation, these are all great questions to start with, but I would argue keep probing and take those data points and pull that back to what platforms are saying they're doing and link that into some story of corporate accountability, because we have to start treating these things like corporations that operate in Australia. And the more we do that, and the less we just treat them as these sort of ephemeral beings that may or may not be distributing unidentified content into the world, I think the better place we'll get to. I hope that makes sense.
It did. Reese, what have you got for us in less than a minute?
I mean, I think it's the same message. We call it the complexity trap. When you talk about this stuff, platforms will always go into like this grey area of, okay, but you've got to say it's this or this. And it's like, no, we don't. There are so many examples of like black and white violations on your platforms. We'll talk about those that actually, you know, if you want action, you've got to try and avoid this complexity trap in conversations that platforms lay out.
It's an excellent place to leave it. Reese, Alice, thank you so much for your time and yeah, for explaining this world that you inhabit to us. We really appreciate it. And thank you to Nick for having us, to the Melbourne Press Club, and to everyone who's taken the time to participate today. And yeah, we'll catch you next time. Thank you.